Happy Sabbath to all of you, and happy 4th of July. I really appreciated the sermonette because, and I breathed a sigh of relief because I almost was going to give that as my sermon, this principle of liberty in law, and that is an important aspect of the freedom that we have in this country. And I think it's important that we recognize that. As was said, we are the recipients of great blessings. And our greatest blessing, of course, is the truth of God for us, actually, to know that, and the redemption that we have in Christ. That's ultimate freedom. We understand that. Jesus said that the truth shall make you free. And he said if the Son, if the Son makes you free, you are free indeed. That is real freedom. And we certainly have that to be grateful for, brethren. But here in this country, we have many great blessings to be thankful for. The freedom that God has given of us to be able to practice the truth in the freedom of our own conscience, to obey and do what we need to do before God. That is a vital aspect of being free, and we're very grateful for it. I'm going to be reading several things today, and pardon me for that, but I actually looked at a million more articles. I was going through various things, and I just thought there's too much here, but there's a few things I wanted to go through that I thought were good reminders on this day to just think about where things are. One thing that made me do this was I saw some people in the midst of this discussion about taking down statues of some of the it started with the Confederate generals, and of course I thought that wouldn't end there, and it hasn't. And of course people have tried to take down Columbus, and they've taken down George Washington, try to take down Abraham Lincoln. They want to take down Thomas Jefferson. They would hit the big memorials if they could. They would all be destroyed. Mount Rushmore would be blown up if they could do it.
And the Liberty Bell, too.
That's right. They would take it all out. But the president did say last night that that's not going to happen to Mount Rushmore, and these monuments are taking a strong stand against people doing those things because it's important. It's important to preserve our history, to understand what America was made of. What brought us about as a country. I mean, they want to even change the country. They want to change the date. They want to get rid of 1776 and change it to a different year in the 1600s that they say was when slaves first came here, who built the country. It's just absolutely amazing. They want to tear everything apart. And it's a sad thing. And it's a sad thing for us, brethren, because we understand the truth of what this country is about. The fact that it is the recipients of the great blessings that God gave to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. Britain was recipients of that wonderful gift, but so was America. And ultimately, in a greater way, America, this past century, the 1900s, Britain dominated the 1800s, but both their dominances started coming up in the 1800s. And created a blessing for the world. God said to Abraham that in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. All the nations. And that's not just through the Jewish people. It is, of course, through all of those who follow the precepts of the Scriptures. And particularly, it includes these descendants of ancient Israel. So we're, again, very privileged to understand that. I'm going to start out today with something from Ronald Reagan, and again, my point in it comes a little bit later. What I heard was someone saying that this doesn't apply, the 4th of July, 1776, Independence Day, that does nothing for me. The Declaration of Independence, these founding fathers, that didn't do anything for my freedom, this person said. That did nothing for my freedom, which of course is absurd. Because how would they even be able to sit here and talk about these things if not for the Declaration of Independence? The very fact that they can have some kind of political debate about these issues and discuss them goes back to things that were done by these great men of history. They weren't perfect men. They made big mistakes, and they also had big scars on their character. But they were also great men, and they had noble aspects of character as well. This is common to man. We understand that. All human heroes are flawed, especially if you go back in history and you take them out of the context of their time. If you move everybody into today's context, you're going to judge them by a different standard than what they understood in the days that they lived. So going to Ronald Reagan here, whenever I see Ronald Reagan, I want to say, well, it's great to see everybody. But he wrote this in Parade magazine back in 1981, in his first year in office. He said, "For one who was born and grew up in the small towns of the Midwest," this is the first sheet, by the way, there, if you want to look at that. For one who was born and grew up in the small towns of the Midwest, there's a special kind of nostalgia about the 4th of July. I remember it as a day almost as long anticipated as Christmas for the world around us. This was helped along by the appearance in store windows of all kinds of fireworks and colorful posters advertising them with vivid pictures. No later than the 3rd of July, sometime earlier, Dad would bring home what he felt he could afford to see go up in smoke and flame. We'd count and recount the number of firecrackers, display pieces, and other things, and go to bed determined to be up with the sun so as to offer the first thunderous notice of the 4th of July. We had a neighbor do that this morning at 8 o'clock. I'm afraid we didn't give too much thought to the meaning of the day, and yes, there were tragic accidents to mar it, resulting from careless handling of the fireworks. I'm sure we're better off today with fireworks largely handled by professionals, yet there was a thrill never to be forgotten in seeing a tin can blown 30 feet in the air by a giant cracker. Giant meaning it was about 4 inches long. But enough of nostalgia. Somewhere in our growing up, we began to be aware of the meaning of the day, and with that awareness came the birth of patriotism. July 4th is the birthday of our nation. I believed as a boy, and believe even more today, that it is the birthday of the greatest nation on earth. There is a legend about the day of our nation's birth. In the little hall in Philadelphia, a day on which debate had raged for hours, the men gathered there were honorable men hard-pressed by a king who had flouted the very laws they were willing to obey. Even so, to sign the Declaration of Independence was such an irretrievable act that the walls resounded with the words treason, the gallows, the headsman's axe, and the issue remained in doubt. The legend says that at this point a man rose and spoke. He is described as not a young man, but one who had to summon all his energy for an impassioned plea. He cited the grievances that had brought them to this moment, and finally, his voice falling, he said, "They may turn every tree into a gallows, every hole into a grave, and yet the words of that parchment can never die. To the mechanic in the workshop, they will speak hope. To the slave in the mines, freedom. Sign that parchment. Sign if the next moment the noose is around your neck, for that parchment will be the textbook of freedom, the Bible of the rights of man forever." He fell back exhausted. The 56 delegates, swept up by his eloquence, rushed forward, and says rush forward. If this happened, it probably wasn't right there at the end, but maybe sometime during this discussion somebody did this. But it says, rush forward and sign that document destined to be as immortal as a work of man can be. When they turned to thank him for his timely oratory, he was not to be found, nor could any be found who knew who he was or how he'd come in or gone out through the locked and guarded doors. Well, that is the legend. But we do know for certain that 56 men, a little band so unique we've never seen their like before, had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. What manner of men were they? 24 were lawyers and jurists, 11 were merchants and tradesmen, and 9 were farmers. They were soft-spoken men of means and education. They were not an unwashed rabble. They had achieved security but valued freedom more. Their stories have not been told nearly enough. John Hart was driven from the side of his desperately ill wife. For more than a year, he lived in the forest and caves before he returned to find his wife dead, his children vanished, his property destroyed. He died of exhaustion and a broken heart. Carter Braxton of Virginia lost all his ships, sold his home to pay his debts, and died in rags. And so it was with Ellery, Clymer, Hall, Walton, Gwinnett, Rutledge, Morris, Livingston, and Middleton. Nelson personally urged Washington to fire on his home and destroy it when it became the headquarters for General Cornwallis. Nelson died bankrupt, but they sired a nation that grew from sea to shining sea. 5 million farms, quiet villages, cities that never sleep, 3 million square miles of forest, field, mountain, and desert, 227 at that time million people, with a pedigree that includes the bloodlines of all the world. In recent years, however, I've come to think of that day as more than just the birthday of a nation. It also commemorates the only true philosophical revolution in all history. Oh, there have been revolutions before and since ours, but those revolutions simply exchanged one set of rules for another. Ours was a revolution that changed the very concept of government. Let the 4th of July always be a reminder that here in this land, for the first time, it was decided that man is born with certain God-given rights, that government is only a convenience created and managed by the people with no powers of its own except those voluntarily granted to it by the people. We sometimes forget that great truth, and we never should. Happy 4th of July. Ronald Reagan understood some important aspects of our country. I want to mention a few more things from the scriptures. If you would turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And I've certainly looked at some of these before, but it's good to review them. To put American freedom in context of the Bible's message. Again, 1 Samuel 8, and that's there's a scripture sheet there for that you can read along with. 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 9. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. This is during the time of the judges. And said to him, "Look, you're old, your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they've not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them." And he went on to show them how the king would basically take a lot of their things and put it in the service of the nation and for the administration of the state. And then skipping down to verses 19 through 22, "Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, 'No, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.' And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. So the Lord said to Samuel, 'Heed their voice and make them a king.'" And turn over to chapter 12, if you would, 1 Samuel 12. This is later, Samuel, after they have received a human king. 1 Samuel 12, verse 12, "And when you saw," Samuel says, "that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, 'No, but a king shall reign over us,' when the Lord your God was your king." When the Lord your God was your king. God was the direct king of the nation. They didn't want that. Israel had, during the time of the judges, what we would call a theocratic republic. It was a republic because there was a governorship of the eldership of the nation, and the elders acted as representatives of the people, and they actually went to a national assembly, and they made decisions together as a nation, and it was ultimately under the direction of the judge and the priests. Those were the ones that God put there to help to guide the people. But a lot of the direction and administration was carried out by these representatives of the people. So you basically had a Hebrew republic, but it was a theocratic republic, meaning it was ruled over by God as the king. Well, when the American colonies began, we were under a king, King George, and under basically a much more powerful monarchy than it is today. But yet Parliament was really dominating things over in Britain as well. They had put the king under certain restraints at that time, and they had a great deal of control. And the Americans wanted no part of that anymore. They didn't want any part of this whole system of peerage and nobility. They wanted freedom. They wanted freedom to live before God without these intervening diktats from the government. And so they listed out in the Declaration of Independence a lot of the problems that were going on, the taxation, the abuses, the way that things would not be dealt with. And so then you had and all during that time you had the American Revolution. And not everybody was necessarily for going to fight right away, but I think about a third wanted to do that, and a third wanted to support the British, and a third just kind of didn't want to necessarily do anything, but something was going to happen. And it wasn't just something that men decided to do. This was time in the annals of human history for something new in the world. And it was brought about by quite great men of their time. These weren't just average people. There was no group of men like these men who came together to create the United States. And that was no accident. I'm sure it was planned out from on high. And we have plenty of evidence to that fact. One evidence I've pointed out before is the very fact that if you look in the Bible and you count the times that it said 7 times until certain destruction befell ancient Israel, would bring you right up to the time of the late 1700s and 1800, when America and Britain became great powers on the world stage. That was predestined. God had determined that from the beginning. And again, it was not any moral superiority of these people of their own, but yet to bless them, God had to give them a certain moral fabric and framework. Because if you are dealing with a bunch of renegade losers and rebels who don't want to do anything that God says to do, and then you give them all these great blessings, what will they be? They'll just be tyrannical despots, controlling everybody. That's not what these men did. These men were about helping other people. I mean, you look at the Bill of Rights. You look at certain governments and you see that they'll tell you you can't really do anything except what is specifically said that you can do. That's a totalitarian state. You want to go live in China, there's things you are allowed to do. And you better be careful, because that's really all you can do. You have to get permission for all that you do. Here it was different. Here, there was actually something that listed out for the government, a list of rules for the government, the things the government is not allowed to do to the people. Never before had anything like this happened. This was absolutely amazing. I mean, there was a predecessor a little bit to that in the Magna Carta and some of the earlier documents, but it was on the way to this, but nothing of this scale. There had been nothing like that. And by the way, that was just so that the king wouldn't be too high above the nobles. That had nothing to do with the people of the country in general. The cry up and down the colonies at the time of the American Revolution was, "No king but King Jesus," because they didn't want a human king, but they wanted a divine king. They wanted to be ruled by God. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, Samuel Adams, who was basically one of the main architects of the American Revolution, he stood up and said, "We have this day restored the sovereign, to whom alone all men should be obedient." He reigns in heaven, and from the rising to the setting of the sun, may his kingdom come. This was a reversal of 1 Samuel, where the people had asked for a human king. They're tired of a human king. Now, God had said back in those days that the people would cry out because of the abuses of the kings, and God would not heed them at that time. But brethren, eventually there came a time when the people cried out about the tyranny of a king, and God did hear them, and God clearly helped them in the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin actually said in the meetings that we have seen many instances of a superintending power. There were many instances of divine providence, of God guiding what was happening. And America was in essence founded as a theocratic republic with God as the king. It sounds kind of far-fetched in a way because we don't think of it like that. But when the Declaration of Independence was signed, remember that while it was rejecting the rule of the British king, it actually said that it was doing so with a firm reliance on divine providence, on the protection of divine providence. And it said that they were appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. That's who they were looking to rule them. They were not looking to their own selfish rule of themselves. You know, it's called the Declaration of Independence, but it was to be independent from Britain and from the king. It was not to be independent totally. It was to be dependent upon Almighty God. And so that was what was established. But of course, there was many concerns not to establish a state church over all, a national church over all the states, and to have some controlling power over people's freedom. That could not be allowed. So you did not have a church-state union in America, but you did have a union of America with Almighty God in the churches, in the individuals, in the governance of the country. There were many appeals to the books of the Bible in rules that were given. It's quite an astounding picture. I think Dr. Hazelton went through that a little bit not too long ago. So, what about the fact that this was a revolution? And we don't typically think that there should be revolutions in the sense that Paul in Romans 13 speaks of being obedient to the governing powers. And certainly that is generally applicably the rule. But there's also the principle of obeying God rather than men. And it got to the point where these people believed that they could not do that in full conscience the way that things were. Now, we could argue whether they were justified in their thinking, but what happened was not strictly from them. That's the other thing I want to stress about this. As I said, it was time to divide these great people, the descendants of Joseph's sons, to have their birthright among the nations fulfilled. It was time to bring about the blessings that had been promised in the Scriptures. But it needed to be grounded in moral to be able to take on these blessings and responsibilities. So God directed things. God directed these men together. God directed the nation into an acknowledgement of Him and into a morality that was needed to be able to be recipients of these blessings. And I would like you to turn, if you would, to 1 Kings 12. 1 Kings 12. And I want to give you an example of a division in Israel that clearly came from God, even though we might argue with the particulars of what happened. 1 Kings 12 in verse 4, this is where the northern Israelites, after Solomon died, came to his son, Rehoboam, and they said, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father, and his heavy yoke which he put on us." He had taxed them quite heavily and took them for work projects. And it says, "And we will serve you if you lighten the load." But he didn't follow that. It says he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men instead of the wiser older men. He went with the advice of the young men, verse 14, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." In other words, I'm going to make it even harder on you. And verse 20, "Now it came to pass when all Israel heard that Jeroboam," and he had been a commander under Solomon who had gone down and ran away. God had foretold that he would be the leader of the northern tribes. But when he had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation and made him king over all Israel. So they basically seceded. The north seceded here from the line of David in the south, in Judah. There was none who followed the house of David but the tribe of Judah only. And actually there was as a whole tribe. But there were some from others that were also there. Verse 21, "And when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah," this is verse 21, "with the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men who were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, that he might restore the kingdom to Rehoboam the son of Solomon." In other words, these guys are rebelling. This is a rebellion, and we're going to put a stop to it. But, verse 22, "But the word of God came to Shemaiah the man of God, saying, Speak to Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says the Lord, You shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me." What thing? The rebellion of the northern tribes. The rebellion was of God. Therefore, they obeyed the word of the Lord and turned back according to the word of the Lord. Now, again, I guess it could be debatable whether in certain aspects of what was done were of God, but I think history bears it out. There was many instances of divine, miraculous help for the American colonies against the British, except for when American forces went up into Canada. And that did not go anywhere. And it, as has been said, it seemed like God had a different plan for Canada. That Canada was to remain part of Britain and not its own, not joined to the United States. That was to be a different country. But God had a purpose and a plan for this country, and He helped what happened. Now, I'll have you turn somewhere else here in a little bit, but we'll put that aside for now. I want to get to another thing that I wanted to read to you that I thought was very good in light of all the goings on today. This is an article. It's actually from a couple weeks ago. It's from June 15th, I think was the date on this, by Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris. He's a martial arts guy and an actor, but he's quite the patriot. And I see some of his commentaries sometimes. And I thought this one was very good. He said, "It seems our society has gone toppling tipsy in wanting to tear down every statue that causes anyone offense. From a Texas Ranger in a Dallas airport to Christopher Columbus in multiple cities, dethroning statues is in vogue. Eyes, in fact, are fixated on toppling 1,700 across the U.S. If House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has her way, 11 statues and soldiers and statesmen of the Confederacy will face their last stand in the halls of the U.S. Capitol." And again, this was when that was really the focus. But then he said, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see where this is going. America's founders' statues are next. And yes, they indeed were next. And then the attention has begun to turn there. And that's where the hue and cry is all about that. He says, "Before they are toppled, I want to educate Americans on the real truths of those who secured our freedoms in the founding of our republic, which are not taught in the public classrooms of liberal academia. First, he encourages people to read his last columns because he talked about how everybody needs to look at themselves and follow what's right and call out what's wrong in whatever it is. And of course, in the thing that happened with George Floyd, I think there was 94% or 96% agreement that was a horrible event that should not have happened. It was an evil thing that happened to that man. And if there's any kind of racial inequity, that should be called out. But again, there's so much inequity the other way that is able to stand these days. But he says it's about reappraising the value of all human beings and returning to the reasons America's founders established our republic. I need to reiterate one thing I said in my last column in order to launch into what I need to say here today. The value of human life has not always fluctuated from person to person like it does today. Most early Americans believed humans were the highest creation of God. Back then, there were two codes that shaped and reflected most people's view of humanity: that God created all of us and that we were created equal. Their views were based in the Bible and expressed in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words were derived from the declaration in the good book. This is from Genesis 1, 26 through 28. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And of course, I'll just interject, they want to get rid of that too. They want to get rid of male and female. They want to get rid of everything that comes from the Word of God. Dr. Thomas G. West, professor of politics and author of Vindicating Our Founders, explained that, quote, "The founders believed that all men are created equal, that they have certain inalienable rights. All are also obliged to obey the natural law under which we have not only rights but duties. We are obliged to respect those rights in others which we value in ourselves." And that's, of course, from Thomas Jefferson, the last part of that. Of course, many today say and teach that our founders were hypocrites. Many believe they didn't mean what they said when they affirmed the belief that we're all created equal because of the fact that many owned slaves, mistreated women, condoned the slaughtering of Indians. Others say America's founders wrote what they meant and were initiating change in the midst of cultural and economic prejudices. I don't have enough room to address every objection, nor do I feel a necessity to defend every action of our founders or their humanity. They didn't treat others perfectly. In many ways, they failed to meet their own expectations. But as George Washington wrote, quote, "We must take human nature as we find it. Perfection falls not to the share of mortals." End quote. John Jay, the first U.S. Justice appointed to the Supreme Court by Washington himself, said about prejudice, "It is a pity that such feelings should exist, but they are the offspring of human nature, which is not what it should be, nor what it once was." That is the way that God had made us. Despite their shortcomings, our founders believed there was something inherent in humanity that called it to a higher purpose. Doing wrong didn't take away from the fact that they could do better. The presence of prejudice didn't negate their desire for equality. The Declaration of Independence was not a guarantee that everyone would always be treated as equals. Equal rights are one thing. Equal treatment is another. It took decades and even centuries before culture would conform to their ideals. Even today, we still seek to practice what they preached. The Declaration of Independence set the course upon which America sails. Though culture would have to catch up to its creeds, inherent within that founding document was the equality for slaves, women, poor, Indians, and even the unborn. Our founders had a dream that one day all people would be treated as equals. As John Adams wrote to Patrick Henry, The dons, the bashaws, the grandees, the patricians, the sachems, that's a tribal chiefs, the nabobs, call them what names you please, sigh and groan and fret. These are all these nobles of the earth. And sometimes stamp and foam and curse, but all in vain. The decree has gone forth, and it cannot be recalled, that a more equal liberty than has prevailed in other parts of the earth must be established in America. What matters here is the fact that the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence and believed in its contents for the founding and future of America. That document announced to the whole world that America was established upon the biblical belief that all men are created equal. So valued was the entire human race that George Washington wrote to John Jay in 1786, "We have probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our confederation." It's going to not go so well all the time. Our founders led the way, warts and all. They even confronted their own biases. For example, while slavery was considered a cultural norm, most founders wrestled with it as a trespass against the Almighty and humanity. Again, George Washington wrote, quote, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it." Washington also demonstrated the value of women when he wrote to Annie Bowdoin Stockton in 1788, "Nor would I rob the fairer sex of their share in the glory of a revolution so honorable to human nature, for indeed I think you ladies are in the number of the best patriots America can boast." John Adams wrote, "Every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States. I have through my whole life held the practice of slavery in abhorrence." Benjamin Franklin stated, "Slavery is an atrocious debasement of human nature." Alexander Hamilton added, "The laws of certain states given ownership in the service of Negroes as personal property, but being men, by the laws of God and nature, they were capable of acquiring liberty. And when the captor in war thought fit to give them liberty, the gift was not only valid, but irrevocable." James Madison explained, "We have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man." Were any of my readers taught in public schools, any of the anti-slavery views of the founders just quoted? Thomas Jefferson spoke about the goal, yet difficult, of abolishing slavery even as late as the 1820s. And by the way, I'm going to come back to Jefferson in a minute because there's some, difficulties expressed about what he did as opposed to what he said. Again, but he said in 1820, "But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." That is why our second president, John Adams, spoke for others when he said, "We should begin by setting conscience free. When all men of all religions shall enjoy equal liberty, property, and an equal chance for honors and power, we may expect that improvements will be made in the human character and the state of society." The founders believed that their declaration of equality would eventually give legs to everyone's freedom. Their struggle for equality made a difference. Their great experiment worked. In just 1 century, America would taste the fruit of respect for all religious beliefs, women's suffrage, and the abolition of slavery. More than merely a foundation for secession, the Declaration of Independence served also as a basis for human worth and equality, and should be reflected in how we treat all other people, from presidents to paupers, from every race, creed, and economic status, including, or maybe especially, those with whom we disagree. Unborn babies are even protected by the Declaration's tenets. No surprise that Jefferson explained preserving human value and life was government's primary role. He said, quote, "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of good government." Today, for most Americans, the Declaration of Independence is a historical document encased under bulletproof glass in Washington, D.C. It's something we tour to see, like all the relics of the past. It reminds us of the valiant time when men fought to gain our independence from Britain, but it's so much more than that. To those of us who understand its meaning and know its power, it's still the answer and creed to fight for equality and maintain civility by reminding us of one another's value as human beings and American citizens. What a perfect document and words to ponder right now as Americans wrestle to understand equality, and especially as we draw closer to Independence Day in a few weeks. That was 2 weeks ago. What America's founders knew was that they could and should begin the process of freedom, but that it would be left for future generations, us, to continue to fight for it. For those reasons alone, their models and statues should remain standing tall as beacons of light for all to see the direction we should go. They are the champions and heroes of our equality. So I thought that was a good assessment of this situation. I'm going to read something else to you from the Declaration that maybe you've never seen. This is from the first draft, the original draft of the Declaration of Independence. Didn't make it in, by the way. But this is what Thomas Jefferson wrote. He was talking about the things that the king had done wrongly in Parliament. Quote, this is from the original draft of the Declaration. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. Captivate, and by the way, if you're looking on a paper there, it's crossed out at the top because it didn't make it in, but I'll continue this. Violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, that is this horrible thing of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he also obtruded them. That is, what he's saying is, now they're telling the slaves in America that they'll be given their freedom if they'll rise up and kill the Americans. So, and he was responsible also for keeping them in slavery. So that was quite a situation that was listed out here in the Declaration. Thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. So you can probably guess, I mean, that didn't make it in. There were certain southern colonies that operate on slavery. Georgia, I think it might have been South Carolina, but they did not agree with that. So they had to make a choice. Do we have the beginning of freedom to kick the can of that end of slavery down the road, or do we give it no chance by having no freedom now at all? And so they agreed to the Declaration, even though not everybody there would. You know, Jefferson, and I've got this on another sheet here, about Jefferson's attitudes towards slavery. Jefferson wrote that, you know, all men are created equal, but he had enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his life. Although he made some legislative attempts against slavery and at times bemoaned its existence, he also profited directly from the institution of slavery and wrote, this says he suspected them to be inferior to white people, but I'm not sure. That might have been in the context of their education and what they were aware of and what they'd been trained in. And again, people are going to take the worst of everything now. But he did, and I'm not going to go through this right now, but Jefferson, I will say a few things. At the time of the American Revolution, Jefferson was actively involved in legislation that he hoped would result in slavery's abolition. In 1778, he drafted a Virginia law that prohibited the importation of enslaved Africans. In 1784, he proposed an ordinance that would ban slavery in the Northwest Territories. But Jefferson always maintained that the decision to emancipate slaves would have to be part of a democratic process. Abolition would be stymied until slave owners consented to their free human property consented to free their human property together in a large-scale act of emancipation. To Jefferson, it was anti-democratic and contrary to the principles of the American Revolution for the federal government to enact abolition or for only a few planters to free their slaves. And that's another reason, supposedly, that he kept people continuing in slavery, and he thought this would actually go badly. But again, I mean, we can sit and judge what these men thought at that time. They didn't have a full appreciation of the things we understand today. And by the way, I would say we don't have a full appreciation of what was all going on at that time. It's quite difficult to look back 200 years and try to think you know how to solve all the problems that existed then. It probably wouldn't work out the way that we think it would. But it says, you know, from the mid-1770s until his death, he advocated the same plan of gradual emancipation. But I'm going to skip ahead on this thing that I've got here. It said, Jefferson thought that white Americans and enslaved blacks constituted two separate nations who could not live together peacefully in the same country. Jefferson's belief that blacks were, well, again, this says inferior, but I'm not sure if that's a fair characterization. I would have to read that statement. But again, not sure what he fully understood or comprehended at the time. But he looked at them as incapable as children. And that sounds to me like he looked at them as because they were not educated and they were not, and their whole upbringing was not like he was as a statesman and the people around him. But coupled with slaves' presumed resentment of their former owners, he thought that was another problem, that they were able, all the resentment that was there would cause a war, made their removal from the United States an integral part of Jefferson's emancipation scheme, influenced by, and that's why you get Liberia and stuff later and all this other kind of stuff over there. Again, he thought that the federal union would be destroyed by slavery. That was his biggest concern. To emancipate slaves on the American soil, you know, he thought that would turn into a large-scale race war that would be as brutal and deadly as the slave revolt in Haiti in 1791. But he also believed that to keep the slaves in bondage, with part of America in favor of abolition and part in favor of perpetuating slavery, could only result in a civil war that would destroy the Union. And that happened. But it didn't, but then it was preserved again through the work of Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to show you something over here on the video for a second that we'll watch briefly, and then I'll come up for a few final comments. This is from Benjamin Shapiro, and I thought this was a good discussion that he gives about the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to have to rewind this a second, if I can, and blow this up. Sorry about that. And maybe we could turn this up a little bit. Yeah, he does talk a little fast, but there's words here at the bottom if you want to get closer.
That is really ugly, and that is the reimagining of American history as inherently evil and really bad, and that means there is a reimagining going on of Independence Day. Now, on the left, this has been going on for quite a while. The idea the Declaration of Independence is bad. Why? Because it lies at the root of the system. Racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia. You hear this sort of stuff from people like Pharrell Williams, who's done pretty well in the United States. You hear it from columnists over at Salon magazine. You're going to hear it increasingly over time as leftists begin to reflect the woke brand of history led by Howard Zinn that basically suggests that America is a bad place and that the Declaration of Independence is really bad, and thus July 4th is not really worth celebrating. Now, all of that is wrong. July 4th is absolutely worth celebrating because July 4th was the celebration of the cementing of certain values that are key to all prosperity, all human freedom in modern civilization. The Declaration of Independence upholds certain immutable fundamental truths upon which all of America is built. It is 100% true that those principles were not lived in accordance with by the Founding Fathers or by subsequent generations of Americans. The whole point of American history is that these principles were true, they were good, and they were realized for more and more Americans over time. Right? That is the real story of American history. So let's talk about the real history of the Declaration of Independence and the principles that it actually embodies for just a second. Beyond all of the woke talk about how all systems of power in the United States, all racist and brutal, spring from the Declaration of Independence. First of all, just a little bit of kind of fun history. The reality is that the Declaration of Independence was actually voted on and signed on July 2nd. So John Adams actually thought that July 2nd was going to be the big day. He wrote about this. He said the second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. So he's only off by 2 days. Right? The reason he was off by 2 days is because July 4th was the day that Congress authorized and printed it. So that was the day that really the American public first got acquainted with the Declaration of Independence. So what is in the Declaration of Independence? Abraham Lincoln rightly suggested that the Declaration of Independence was essentially an apple of gold, and that the Constitution, which was framed in order to make present the values of the Declaration, was the frame of silver. So he described it that way. He said this is the apple of gold, and the Constitution is the frame of silver designed to sort of embody the values of the Declaration in a governmental structure. This is what the Federalist Papers are all about. The Federalist Papers are all about how you take the high principles of the Declaration and then implement them in real life. And of course, all of American history is about how those high principles are made manifest for more and more human beings over time. Let me just read you, because it's such a beautifully written document. There's a reason that there are statues of Thomas Jefferson, and they're not because he was a slaveholder. It is not because of his relationship, his perverse relationship with Sally Hemings. The reason that Thomas Jefferson was president of the United States is because he wrote these words. And these words are still some of the most glorious words ever written. This is from the Declaration of Independence, and it is the key to American philosophy. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Okay, that long sentence is probably the most famous sentence and the most important sentence in all of American history, one of the most famous and important sentences in all of human history. Our founding fathers pledged their lives and their duty and their sacred honor to those principles. So did the soldiers who fell to fight slavery at Gettysburg. So did the civil rights heroes who were standing in order to make present those promises, to fulfill the promissory note, as Martin Luther King Jr. suggested, that was laid out in the Declaration of Independence. So what does this mean? Well, the philosophy of the U.S. rests on three basic principles. First, the reality of natural rights pre-existing government. Government does not create your rights. Your rights pre-exist government. That means that the government is instituted in order to protect those rights. This is point number two. To invade your rights, the government is only in power to protect the rights you had before government. So that means the government does not get to dictate your rights. Government does not get to encroach upon your rights. They are, in fact, inalienable. They are unalienable or inalienable. There's still debate over which word is proper. Adams picked inalienable. Jefferson picked unalienable. Big fight at the time. Those two principles, the reality of natural rights that pre-exist government, that's a big thing, because if you're a communist, you believe all rights come from the government. The right to property comes from the government. The right to healthcare comes from the government. It's not just a communist thing. That is sort of a social left-wing thing now, more broad left-wing thing, is that there are positive rights that government provides to you. That's not what the Declaration says. It says you have rights to life, liberty, and property. They existed in a state of nature. They pre-exist government. This comes from Lockean philosophy, the philosophy of John Locke. And then, government is instituted to protect those rights, not to invade those rights. Government is there to make sure that nobody else invades your life, your liberty, or your property. That is what government exists to do at its most fundamental level. And finally, the equality of all human beings before the law. When the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, it does not mean that we all have the same abilities, because obviously that's stupid and untrue. It doesn't mean that we are all the same height. It doesn't mean that we all have the same qualities. It means that we are all equal before the law. We are all equal in the rights given to us by God that predate government. And those are the three principles, the fundamental principles. The Constitution was created in order to protect these principles. Right? It created a system of checks and balances so that you couldn't have a majority just override individual rights in the name of the so-called common good. The Constitution was a compromise document because they had to be hammered out. That means there are serious flaws in the Constitution, specifically, for example, the 3/5 clause. But the 3/5 clause, contrary to modern popular opinion, which is wrong, was designed to actually minimize slave power, not to maximize slave power. The slave states wanted all slaves to be counted for purposes of congressional apportionment, but then not to be able to vote. So counting 3/5 was a compromise designed to actually lessen slave state power. This is clear to all constitutional historians and scholars who have actually studied the issue. The constitutional system's enumerated powers, right, were designed to prevent the government from encroaching on your rights. The government only has these specific powers. The government does not have any other power. Because if you give the government more power, it has more power to invade the rights that were guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence. Now, one of the things that the modern disintegrationists, as I call them in my new book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps, one of the things the modern disintegrationists have very much in common with the people who were in favor of slaveholding in the Constitution is they believe the Declaration and the Constitution were severable. The reason we celebrate July 4th, and it's become much more of a celebration day than Constitution Day, is because Constitution Day is really about the implementation of a governmental system. The Declaration is about those highfalutin principles. There's a line of people in American history who didn't like those principles. So slaveholders didn't like those principles. John C. Calhoun said the Declaration of Independence was a lie. He said the Constitution was the only thing that mattered because it was just a bargain between the states, and if that bargain was violated, then you got to dissolve the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln argued that the Constitution was meant to embody the principles of the Declaration, which is why the federal government had the power to move toward fulfilling the principles of the Declaration of Independence, even if it meant rewriting the bargain of the Constitution a little bit in accordance with the Declaration, right? That is the main debate then. Woodrow Wilson, an enemy to freedom, also suggested that the Declaration of Independence no longer mattered because the very concept of natural rights, individual natural rights, prevented the government from doing the vast work that it needed to do. The progressive movement was based on the idea that the founders were wrong. There were no immutable truths, self-evident truths. There was no equality before law because absolutely certain people should be given certain privileges. And we see this now in the notion that if you are of a particular ilk, then you don't deserve good treatment at the hands of the law. Brett Kavanaugh is a good example of this. Due process doesn't apply to Brett Kavanaugh because Brett Kavanaugh is white and male and has benefited from the system. And so anybody who upholds the notion of equal justice before law is actually upholding a system that is in and of itself evocative of hierarchies. So there are two speeches that I think are really important when we talk about July 4th. One is from Frederick Douglass, who, as I've said, is the second founding father. And the second is from Calvin Coolidge, maybe the most underrated president in American history. Frederick Douglass speaks of why July 4th didn't originally apply to black Americans and suggests its shortcoming. He spoke this in 1852, while slavery was still very much alive. And suffice it to say, Frederick Douglass suffered a lot more under slavery than anybody alive today. Right, so Frederick Douglass, in saying this, is recognizing the great principles of July 4th and recognizing that those principles had to be extended. And in their extension, it made July 4th worth celebrating for all Americans. He said, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled and was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? That was the question of American history. The answer of the Civil War was yes. The answer of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Movement was yes. It was MLK who cited the Declaration of Independence as the inspiration for the Civil Rights Movement. That's why July 4th is worth celebrating. And then there's Calvin Coolidge's speech. It was given on the 150th anniversary of July 4th. It's a beautiful speech. He talks about the innate value of the principles. He's really arguing with Woodrow Wilson here, who said that the Declaration of Independence was hackneyed and the phraseology was old. Calvin Coolidge says, if all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anybody wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. We live in an age of science and of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our Declaration. Our Declaration created them. In other words, all the good stuff in your life, in America, that springs from the philosophy of the Declaration. Do not throw it away. Do not throw away July 4th simply because you have a more attractive version of history that you'd like to present and makes you more self-righteous than you actually are. July 4th is a great celebration of fundamental American principles. Those principles are well worth celebrating for all of us. Hope you have a wonderful Independence Day. And while you're at it, go pick up a copy of How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps, which discusses all of this at more length. If you enjoyed this video,
You can close that now, if you just push it down. I think it's... So I thought that was excellent, and I did want to share that. No, it's 10 minutes. No, I don't think so. 11 maybe. I think it's 11. I think it's 11. Well, probably if you slow him down to the normal speed. Now that's how fast he speaks.
He speaks in bursts.
He's quite a rapid talker, but he's got a lot to say. Anyway, let me wrap this up rather quickly here. I would like you to turn over, if you would, also to 2 Chronicles 30. and I want to mention something right there. This is the time of Hezekiah's great Passover that he observed, and he sent, we're going to look at verses 10 through 12. So the runners passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun. Now these were after the Assyrians had attacked the northern kingdom, but there was still a small remnant state there of the northern kingdom. And so Hezekiah sent runners up there to say, hey, we're going to have a big Passover. We're going to reinstitute the worship of the true God down here. And a lot of people didn't go for that. It says, but they laughed at them and mocked them, verse 10. Nevertheless, verse 11, some from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun, they're the northern tribes, humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. And why? Here's the key. And what was the thing with Judah? Why was Judah turning to God at this time? They had been under a bad king, Ahaz. He was a very bad guy, and they had all been operating in paganism. But it says, verse 12, also the hand of God was on Judah to give them singleness of heart to obey the command of the king and the leaders at the word of the Lord. So the key is that God was turning the people back to him. And that's what I want to stress about what happened at the beginning of America is, look, these were not perfect men. They didn't know the truth in many respects. There's things that they didn't understand. We wouldn't necessarily look to them as the paragon of all virtue. But nevertheless, I point out, God had to bring these people to a certain moral caliber to be able to receive these great blessings that God was going to pour out on the nation. Otherwise, it would have been a disaster. There would, if you had horribly evil people being the recipients of great blessings, that just would be a disaster. And so God made sure that these men were of upright character, and what they instituted were checks on power. They actually created a three-branch government, a separation of powers to keep people from becoming too powerful. They created a difference of power between the states and between the general populace to prevent mob rule. There's so many things that they did to check the problems of human nature that would be trying to grab power and oppress people. And we are blessed for that. If those men had not come up with this, where would we be? Where would the world be that has taken so many examples from that? But of course, the world is devolving around us today. I'm going to finish with something. This is, I think, very interesting because, again, it speaks to God's involvement in these events. This is an article from Brent Smith called Independence Day Deaths Marked by Divine Providence. There were five founding fathers who became president. Some would say that no, in fact, there were six. What about John Quincy Adams? Was he a founder? No, he was the son of second President John Adams, but was a child of the Revolution. So the five in order were George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. It was divine providence that brought all these great men together at this exact place and time in history. It was through acts of divine providence that the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were crafted and signed. It was divine providence that assisted in the founding of our nation. And it was by divine providence that God put his final stamp on the founding of the United States with the passing of 3 of the 5 founder presidents on the day of America's declared independence. By the way, Independence Day, July 4th, 1776, I think it's interesting because remember, Adams thought it would be the 2nd, but it ended up being the 4th because that's when it was proclaimed, and the 4th is the day. And the 4th is the day, it was also, by the way, a significant day on the Hebrew calendar. That was the 17th of Tammuz. That was quite that was one of the fast days of the Jews, commemorating destruction in the ancient times of the temple and of the nation and things that had happened. But here again, this is a birth of freedom here in our modern times. But anyway, 3 of the 5 founder presidents would die on the day of America's declared independence. And save for just 6 days, it could have actually been 4. And maybe it would not be a stretch to say it was basically 4. Most of us know, he says, the more remarkable timing that marked the passing of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson on July 4th, 1826, within hours of one another. It's frankly one of the strangest occurrences in American history. It was just an incredible timing that both highly influential founders and former enemies turned friends would both pass on the 50th anniversary of our founding. It would seem virtually impossible without divine providence. Both men lived far beyond the average lifespan of the time, which was 37 years, as Jefferson was 83 and Adams 90. And they both lived to the 50th anniversary of July the 4th, and they died that same day. Some of Adams' last words were reported to be, "Jefferson survives." For Jefferson, he was said to have twice asked, once on the evening of July 3rd, once just after midnight, "Is it the 4th?" Some say this is proof that the two were just trying to hang on until that day, but others remark differently. Daniel Webster, during his eulogy given in Boston for both Adams and Jefferson, said that the fact that both men passed on the 50th anniversary was proof from on high that our country and its benefactors are objects of his care. New York Congressman Churchill Chamberlain, in his eulogy of Jefferson, said, "The body had wasted away, but the energies of a powerful mind, struggling with expiring nature, kept the vital spark alive till the meridian sun shone on our 50th anniversary. Then content to die, the illustrious Jefferson gave to the world his last declaration." Then, just 5 years later, on July 4th, 1831, the last Revolution-era president, James Monroe, passed at the age of 73. This remarkable coincidence was not wasted by the press at the time. The New York Evening Post reported that it was a coincidence that has no parallel. 3 of the 4 presidents who have left the scene of their usual usefulness and glory expired on the anniversary of the national birthday, a day which, of all others, had it been permitted to them to choose, they would probably have selected for the termination of their careers. The Boston Traveler wrote, again, our national anniversary has been marked by one of those events which it may be scarcely permitted to ascribe to chance, and the Journal of Commerce noted, thus 3 of the 4 ex-presidents have died on the memorable 4th of July, and 2 of them on the same 4th of July. A coincidence so extraordinary is scarcely to be found in history. And 3 out of 5 is a remarkable coincidence? I think not. I believe it more than that. But what about the 4th? It could easily be argued James Madison, too, was tied to the Day of Independence, as they refer to it, for he passed on June 28, 1836. On that day, 60 years earlier, June 28, 1776, the final draft of the Declaration of Independence was submitted to the Continental Congress. So he died on a day that was tied to that. But anyway, just an interesting fact. A coincidence? I don't think so, brethren. This is remarkable. God has blessed our nation, and we have so much to be grateful for at this time.